and it makes you wonder at the animal. What? When a dog sees someone it doesn't know, it gets angry before anything bad happens to it. But when it knows someone, it welcomes him, even if it has never received anything good from him. Haven't you ever wondered at that? I've never paid any attention to it, but obviously that is the way a dog behaves. Surely this is a refined quality in its nature, and one that is truly philosophical. That's the first time actually that Plato uses the word philosophical in the Republic. In what way philosophical? Because it judges anything it sees to be either a friend or an enemy on no other basis than that it knows the one and doesn't know the other. And how could it be anything besides a lover of learning if it identifies what is its own and what is alien to it in terms of knowledge and ignorance? It couldn't. But surely the love of learning is the same thing as philosophy or the love of wisdom. It is. Then we may too confidently assume, in the case of a human being, that if he is to be gentle towards his own and those he knows, he must be a lover of learning and wisdom. We may. Plato here is claiming that animals share the ability to make knowledge distinctions on the basis of loyalty. They exhibit recognition or familiarity on past experience and the ability to defend against what is unfamiliar and unknown. The assertion of a higher faculty of the soul is what tempers the potential viciousness of the guardians and watchdogs, cooling the guardian spirit. This faculty is the philosophical component, with its corresponding capacity for memory and the ability to make distinctions between the known and unknown, familiar and unfamiliar. And many of these faculties of judgment are shared with the best of dogs, an assertion that permits the conclusion that Plato has extended rationality to animal life. Just to go a bit further, Plato, in talking about the guardian pedagogy, he also talks about how we need to set up the guardian class in terms of what goods they should receive, whether they should have a private life. He ends up saying that they really shouldn't have a private life, kind of living a proto-communist block where they all share the goods and receive their goods by taxation of the city. But this guardian life was also thought to have environmental and social responsibilities endemic to it. So the guardian ecology is actually quite present there, as the guardians were to educate others by telling a tale in which they were born from the earth. If you study philosophy, this is known as the myth of the metals. And in this tale, members of the city were actually born from the soil with precious metals embedded in their souls, corresponding to their position in the class of society. So the myth of the metals actually served the end of obliging citizens to the homeland and the earth itself, viewing the natural soil as mother and the members of the society as natural family. And I'm going to just quote from Plato here. He says, "If anyone attacks the land in which they live, they must plan on its behalf and defend it as their mother and nurse, and think of the other citizens as their earth-born brothers." So this unity of guardian education with animal rearing and the ecological obligations of the class tell a tale of unification with the animal and nature, contrasting with a modern perspective of estrangement from nature and estrangement from the animal as an object of property. Studying the history of philosophy, there's a specific logic of alienation and mastery of the animal and from nature as humanity began to develop its sense of culture and enlightenment. Not surprisingly, nature became an inanimate object at the moment where property rights emerged in political discourse, and roughly at the same time when industrial expansion and colonialism were Europe's primary enterprises. I want to say a little bit about Descartes and move on just for the sake of time, make sure that this is going to just take about half an hour so we have time for questions and everything. But from Plato, I felt the necessity to include Descartes, both for his historical position in the history of philosophy, but also because I thought that his thought and his metaphysical distinctions were so pervasive that they had influenced all subsequent philosophy, and they really expressed the ideology of animals at the time. Descartes himself was known to perform living vivisections, living dissections on animals, and that just was completely consistent with his view that animals were essentially machines. So I'm going to just prove this point very briefly. It's kind of well worn in philosophy, but I think it's really important to the view of animals as objects of property. So in the Discourse on Method, Descartes actually establishes a medical and scientific distinction between the soul of man and that of brutes, claiming that reason or sense is, quote, the only thing that constitutes us men and distinguishes us from brutes, end quote. Thus, animals lack the ability to reason. As Verena Corley points out in Animal Philosophy, reading nature under the Cartesian model carries the dangerous potential to reduce animals to soulless machines, paving the way for Enlightenment philosophies that generally reduce the natural world to an external object, finding value in nature only through its submission to human utility. For example, Descartes, he wrote in his letter to Moore, I soon perceived quickly that animal movement could all originate from the corporeal and mechanical principle, and I regard it as certain that we cannot at all prove the presence of a thinking soul in animals. I am not disturbed by the astuteness and cunning of dogs and foxes, or by things animals do for the sake of food, sex, and fear. I claim that I can easily explain all of them as originating from the structure of their bodily parts. Since art copies nature, and people make various automatons which move without thought, it seems reasonable that nature should even produce its own automatons, which are more splendid than the artificial ones, namely the animals. Cartesian skepticism also had a tendency to treat nature as an object of the human mind. Descartes famously claims in part 6 of the Discourse on Method that philosophy initiates an investigation into the natural elements, examining the force of fire, water, air, the stars, heavens, and all other bodies that environ us. But this is all done toward the end of appropriating those resources for their use value, and thus to, quote, render us ourselves the masters and possessors of nature, end quote. Taking this lead, Cartesian humanism implies a lack of intrinsic worth for the external object world, including those ecosystems on which we thrive. This view, too, can give the harmful consequence of removing non-human life and natural resources from the domain of ethics. The Cartesian account of the environment and its animal inhabitants is one that identifies nature as a mechanical object of inquiry, discernible not by phenomenal experience, but by scientific analysis, which is something that David Abram draws attention to in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous. He writes that this tendency actually extended back to Galileo, who tried to explain the universe in terms of measurement. Quote, Galileo had already asserted that only those properties of matter that are directly amenable to mathematical measurement, such as size, shape, and weight, are real. The other more subjective qualities, such as sound, taste, and color, are merely illusory impressions. Yet it was only after the publication of Descartes' Meditations in 1641 that reality came to be commonly spoken of as a strictly material realm, end quote. So both the unreal nature of phenomena and the Cartesian identification of humanity with rationalism contribute to a dyadic view of humanity and ecology. The material world of non-human anima is contrasted to the metaphysical exclusivity of human thought. Okay, so now I'm going to go and just jump forward to social contract theory, which was kind of a big bulk of my thesis as well. The history of contract theory actually weaved together two tales of the life of nature. Nature then became this dual metaphor. On the one hand, it was a metaphor for the life of man prior to culture, which encompassed all of his primitive instincts and animal functions. And on the other hand, it represented the aggregate environmental resources and life forms that man finds himself both communing with and possessing for survival. So nature was therefore positioned as both intrinsic and external to humanity. Such a duplicity, I thought, made any concept at marking a distinct human territory impossible, and actually made any concept of material property outside of nature's extended progeny unreachable. The early social contractors, Hobbes and Locke in particular, distinguish distinctly human political territories by virtue of an economic process, where the animal is a sheer instrument for human production. Estranged from the naturally social species of Aristotle and Plato, humanity in Hobbes became separate from nature, as an artificial animal that is engrossed with its own egoism and the perpetual fulfillment of its fleeting material desires. Nature and the animal become tools for human utility and law, and the onus to develop nature and colonize its inhabitants is